All right, so we're finishing up our study on Timothy this evening. Also, the notes for Titus and Silas are on the back table. I also emailed them out already. In case you haven't gotten those, we will likely get to Titus tonight, but I don't know how far we'll get. So, we're going to pick up, we already talked about Acts chapter 16, verses 1 through 3, where we are first introduced to Timothy. We know that it would appear that he was a young fella. Certainly, Paul refers to his youth in the letters to Timothy. We know that he was already baptized when Paul came upon him on what we call Paul's second missionary journey in Acts 16. We know that he was half Greek, half Jew. His mother and his grandmother were both Jews, and he was raised in the teaching of the Old Testament, the prophecies. In fact, here in 2 Timothy chapter 1, Paul calls Timothy a beloved son, and he refers to the genuine faith or unfeigned faith that was in his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice, and he is persuaded is in Timothy as well. And then we also talked about in 1 Timothy, Paul references the gift that was laid on by the hands of the eldership. That's in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 18, and then in chapter 4, verse 14, there's references to prophecies as well. We don't know exactly what those prophecies entailed, other than certainly perhaps maybe the fact that he would teach the gospel or something along that line maybe. And that may have played a part in Paul choosing to take Timothy with him, although we aren't told when those prophecies took place. It's very possible Paul had already chosen to take Timothy, and then the prophecies came, but we don't know. The laying on of the hands of the eldership there are not about miraculous gifts. It's about the laying hands on to a purpose, just as Paul and Barnabas were laid hands on by the elders of Antioch back in Acts chapter 13, end of Acts chapter 12 and into Acts chapter 13. Excuse me. But here in chapter 2, or in the second letter to Timothy in chapter 1, and in verse 6, Paul says, "Therefore I remind you to stir up the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands." Now, Paul, as far as we know, there's no ever any reference to Paul being an elder. There's no reference to Paul ever being married or having children. And so by the qualifications of an elder, he couldn't have been an elder if he didn't have family. But the laying on of his hands would seem to indicate the miraculous gifts that Timothy may have had. We don't know what gifts those would have included, but certainly most likely, at the very least, gifts of knowledge would have probably been a part of that as well. And there may have been multiple gifts, as we see people being laid hands on to receive multiple gifts as well. In Romans chapter 16, Paul refers to Timothy as a fellow worker. As we noted here in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1, he refers to him as a beloved son. Here in verse 2, and we see in chapter 2, in verse 1, he refers to him, my son. He refers in 1 Corinthians 4, my beloved and faithful son. In 1 Timothy 1, verse 2, a true son in the faith. And so there are multiple references. Only once is he ever referred to as our brother. There is one reference to Paul referring to him as, obviously they were brothers in Christ, but every other time, Paul refers to Timothy as his son in the faith. And again, that's not that Paul baptized him. In fact, all the evidence points to the fact that he was already a Christian when Paul came on that second journey. So he had been converted, Timothy had, or been baptized at some point between when Paul helped establish a church there and then when Paul had come back around, between maybe a year and 3 or 4 years, depending on which timeline you look at, that was going on between the first and second journeys. But certainly I think it indicates the relationship that existed between Paul and Timothy. Sometimes we refer to it or think of it as a mentor-mentee, and that's certainly, I think you certainly have that component there. But I tend to think that this wasn't just some formal, like maybe Paul was with Gamaliel, although we don't know all the details about kind of their relationship. We do know Paul was raised at the feet of Gamaliel. It's very possible that Gamaliel was almost like a father figure to Paul as well when he was growing up. Remember, he was raised in Jerusalem, being taught the law by literally the master teacher of the law. Gamaliel is referred to as the master teacher in the Talmud, I believe it is. But then we have this example or this understanding that there's obviously a close relationship between Paul and Timothy. We see that in Philippians chapter 2 and in verse 19, there's an interesting reference to Timothy here. Philippians chapter 2 and in verse 19, Paul says, "But I trust in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you shortly, that I may also be encouraged when I know your state. For I have no one like-minded who will sincerely care for your state. For all seek their own, not the things which are of Christ Jesus. But you know his proven character, that as a son with his father, he served with me in the gospel. Therefore, I hope to send him at once as soon as I see how it goes with me." So we see certainly Paul, these individuals who were with Paul often sent them out to report on how the brethren are doing. He's going to do the same thing with Titus. He does the same thing with Silas. These individuals would go to places where Paul couldn't be everywhere at once. But he utilized these individuals to help him in the encouragement and administering of the gospel. But with regard to the Philippians, it's interesting that Paul says that he has no one like-minded who will sincerely care. I don't believe that's saying that people like Silas or Titus weren't like-minded. I just think that they weren't available, so he wouldn't have included them if they were somewhere else already. So the fact that there's no one else on whom Paul could call or use to send to Philippi that he could count on. There was no one else but Timothy. And the fact that he says, verse 22, "You know his proven character, that as a son with his father, he served with me in the gospel." And obviously there are some commentaries that suggest, well, he's just pointing out the kind of service that an apprentice would serve to their father. Oftentimes, especially in the New Testament times, a son would go into the same profession as his father. His father would serve as teacher to his son. However, I tend to think that there may be a little bit more to it than just apprentice to master or mentor to mentee. The fact that he uses that son and father relationship as an example, I think also kind of solidifies what we can understand their relationship was like. And you have to figure too, from Timothy's end, the fact that his father was a Gentile, a Greek, and as far as we know, we're never told that Timothy's father was ever converted. So at least, especially as far as the faith was concerned, Paul was Timothy's father in the faith. Okay, he's his teacher, his friend, his role model, all of that in the faith. And so I think that's a very interesting reference here in Philippians chapter 2, particularly there in verse 20 and 22. Thoughts or comments through that? All right. We know that Timothy was with Paul when he wrote to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 1. In fact, at the end of 1 Corinthians in chapter 16, he mentions the fact that he had hoped to send Timothy to the Corinthians at some point after he wrote 1 Corinthians. It would seem actually Titus may have carried the letter of 1 Corinthians to Corinth, because that's what he mentions, if Timothy comes. So obviously that would make sense for Paul to say that if Timothy was actually bringing the letter to the Corinthians. But he's also referenced in Philippians 1 and in verse 1 to the Philippians, the Colossians, both letters of the Thessalonians, as well as Philemon. That's not to say he wasn't with Paul at some of the writing of the others. Those were the only ones where he specifically mentioned. So I just think that's kind of notable as well. We see in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and in verse 3 that that Timothy stays in Ephesus for a period of time. It is interesting and notable that Corinth and Ephesus are perhaps two of the places where Paul and those associated with Paul preached and taught the most. Corinth, there was at least 2 years there. Ephesus, there was maybe 3.5 years at least. And then when you add to that the time that Timothy may have spent as well, it is kind of notable that they spent so much time with these brethren there. Not to say that they necessarily needed more help or that they were in some way less equipped or anything like that. It's just, I think it's notable that maybe the spread of the gospel was, there was a lot more opportunity there or whatever. As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, remain in Ephesus that you may charge them that they teach no other doctrine. There's lots of charges in 1st and 2nd Timothy. Lots of Paul issues a lot of instruction to Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy. There's some specifics and there's a lot more general of teaching the gospel, standing for the truth, make sure the brethren maintain their stand in the truth. In 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 10, as I mentioned, Paul references when Timothy comes, but he also references there the fact that Timothy does the work of the Lord. 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and in verse 10, if Timothy comes, see that he may be with you without fear, for he does the work of the Lord as I also do. Therefore let no one despise him, but send him on his journey in peace that he may come to me, for I am waiting for him with the brethren. It is interesting that he says in verse 11, let no one despise him, which is the same type of language he used to Timothy himself, let no one despise your youth. So it is possible that due to Timothy's particular youth, it's very possible that Timothy may have been late teens, early 20s even, when all of this is taking place. It's very possible that there were places that he went where the brethren were maybe not as patient with him or weren't willing to receive him as they may have received Paul because he was so young. And the fact that there's at least two references which would see Paul doesn't say anything about his youth here, but it is interesting that Paul he doesn't refer to that with anybody else about despising them. But Timothy, which of these three that we're talking about today, or through this lesson, Timothy, Titus, and Silas, Timothy would seem to have been the youngest of the three. So I think that's notable as well. Any thoughts through that? As I said, Paul sent Timothy, Titus, Silas on different places. Here in 1 Corinthians 16, he's going to send them to Corinthians. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 19, he's planning to send Timothy to the Philippians as well. A lot of time in the area of Macedonia, of Greece. Ephesus, of course, is right across the channel over into Asia Minor, remember? So there's a lot of teaching and preaching being done in that particular area by Timothy, as well, for that matter, as Titus and Silas, whereas we're going to note here in just a minute. All right. There were several occasions where Timothy would bring back a report regarding the brethren. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, Timothy brought back a report regarding the good news of the Thessalonians' faith and love. And as we noted here in 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, he wrote two letters that we know of to Timothy. Now, I stress that we know of because I don't think in any way we necessarily have everything that Paul ever wrote. For that matter, what Peter wrote or what any of the apostles wrote. What we do have is what we need. Okay, God made sure that what we have is everything that we need, all things that pertain to life and godliness. So I know that there's nothing else that Paul wrote that would have taught anything different than what we already have. Paul himself told the Corinthians that he teaches the same thing at every church. So there's nothing different. But that's not to say that there may not have been other letters to Timothy, or for that matter, other letters to Titus, or a letter to Silas, or a letter to Barnabas. We just don't have those. But I think it is interesting that throughout 1 and 2 Timothy, Paul, when you read those letters and you read them with a perspective of as a father to a son, you kind of hear that emotional connection, that phileo love, not just agape, but phileo love kind of contained in Paul's words. And I think that's it's both sweet and also kind of an acknowledgement of Paul's deep care and concern, especially for these men who are helping him in teaching the gospel. He says in verse 15 that one of the purposes why he was writing, for instance, 1 Timothy, and I would even say 2 Timothy as well, is so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the ground of the truth. In chapter 6, there are several calls for Timothy to flee certain things. For instance, verse 11, you, O man of God, as he calls Timothy, flee these things, and that's particular to, in the context, that's regarding the love of, or the desire for money, the love of money, and all the dangers that that brings. So he says, pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, gentleness. He also references on many occasions the fact that he had followed Paul's life. He had followed Paul's character, his all the things that Paul went through, his persecutions, that Timothy not only paid attention to those things, but sought to emulate those in his life as well. So Paul knew that he was a role model. He knew that Timothy looked up to him. And certainly for all of us, when we know people are watching us, that helps us, that motivates us to be very careful with our example. And I think that's notable as well. Not necessarily that Paul needed help, but just to know that all of these young men were looking up to him, especially these men that he's taking with him, who are with him not just 3 hours a week. They're with him 24 hours a day, thrown in prison with him, being beaten with him. Knowing that you have that accountability, that those eyes that are on you, those ears that are listening, certainly helps us to be more aware of ourselves, be more aware of what example. And anyone who's a parent or a grandparent or who has been around children for any length of time, I think we have that same feeling of knowing that they're watching us, especially if you've ever had a kid repeat you or reference something that an adult said. You know that they're always watching, they're always listening. And certainly that applies to our older kids as well. Yeah, our older individuals are looking up to those who are older than them, more experienced in the faith as well. Thoughts or comments through that? Okay. In Hebrews chapter 13, which I know many people believe that Paul wrote Hebrews. I don't believe that. I believe that John Mark or Barnabas perhaps wrote Hebrews, or not Barnabas, although some people do believe Barnabas wrote it. It would seem to me that whoever wrote Hebrews had a deep and intimate understanding of the inner workings of the temple, and particularly of how all of the sacrifices and everything took place. Barnabas was of the tribe of Levi, but he was not from Jerusalem. He was from Crete. And so it's possible that it was Barnabas. I tend to think maybe John Mark, and I think it would be a awesome sense of irony that the one who was once not profitable for Paul in the teaching of the gospel would, as Peter refers to, and as Paul also makes mention that he is profitable to him, now later on after he kind of grew a bit and matured a bit, that he would write a letter that is so profound as the letter of the Hebrews. But in Hebrews chapter 13 and in verse 23, starting in verse 22, I appeal to you, brethren, bear with the word of exhortation, for I have written to you in few words. Know that our brother Timothy has been set free, with whom I shall see you if he comes shortly. The fact that the Hebrew letter is also being written in that 65, 66, most estimates put it around 4 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. The Hebrew writer refers to the destruction of Jerusalem on several occasions. The fact that Paul, as of 65 and 66, was in prison in Rome the second time, and he is, if not having already been put to death, he is about to be. So the fact that the Hebrew writer, that there's just several different contextual evidences that suggest that it may not have been Paul that wrote this. But we see here in verse 23 that Timothy had been thrown in prison at some point. For what, and what the situation was, how long he was in prison, we don't know. But the fact was, certainly Timothy had been told on numerous occasions that all those who suffer, or all those who seek to live godly will suffer persecution, 2 Timothy 3. And certainly Timothy had gone through persecution with Paul as well on numerous occasions. It would seem, although we don't know much from this statement, but perhaps Timothy, this was an occasion where he was not with Paul when he was thrown in prison. He was perhaps on his own, but we don't know for sure. Thoughts or comments through that? In 1 Timothy chapter 4, the final passage for our Timothy study, and in verse 10, Paul makes a reference to the fact that he needs to instruct the brethren and so forth, and he says in verse 10 regarding the teaching of the gospel, for to this end we both labor and suffer reproach because we trust in the living God, who is the Savior of all men, especially those who believe. Paul writing this to Timothy, acknowledging that Timothy also is bearing reproach in the teaching of the gospel. It's in this same text that he tells Timothy in verse 12, let no one despise your youth, but be an example to the believers and of. That term to the believers or of the believers is translated both ways in different translations, but that term can mean either one. Whether we're talking about to the believers, which I believe in this context, given that we're talking about teaching the brethren, instructing the brethren, I tend to think that's Paul's intent, is being an example to the brethren. But that's not to say that Timothy also wasn't to be an example of the brethren out and about wherever he may have been at the time. But then this is, of course, we talk about the laying on of the hands of the eldership and so forth. Thoughts or comments through that? Okay, so tradition holds that Timothy died somewhere around 97 AD. This would likely have meant that the Apostle John outlived even Timothy. And I'm likely many of the first generation and even maybe even some of the second generation Christians, John being perhaps dying around 100 AD, would have outlived many of them. But the tradition, the story, again, this is extra biblical, but the story claims that Timothy, while serving as an elder in Ephesus, attempted to hold a procession in honor of the goddess Diana by preaching the gospel, and then he was stoned to death. And again, that's tradition, that's legend, I guess you could say. But would it surprise you? I mean, what had happened already in Ephesus before this that might have been related? Yeah, you had that whole situation with Paul and those who were with Paul having taught that there was one God, and all of these silversmiths and artisans get upset because their livelihood depended on creating statues of Diana. And keep in mind that Ephesus was the center of Diana worship. That's where the temple of Diana was. And so the fact that this was their livelihood that Paul was threatening, that caused a big uproar. And so the idea that Timothy, and remember, we know that Timothy had spent quite a bit of time at Ephesus. It's not beyond the realm of possibility that he eventually settled and stayed in Ephesus, became an elder, and then at some point in an effort to try to talk to people about the dangers of idolatry or whatnot, I don't know if he would have attempted to stop a procession. But, I mean, if people are going to do what they want to, but at the very least he may have been trying to persuade people in the midst of that procession or that honor of Diana that there is only one God, and it's very possible that that could have led to his death. There's no evidence of that, but I have no doubt that that's something Timothy certainly would have been willing to do. Thoughts or comments through that? All right, so let's talk about Timothy for a minute. Out of all of the examples of Timothy, all the references to Timothy, what may have been, I say may because there's nothing negative that I can find that is expressly negative or that he made any mistakes or anything like that. Nothing that was critical of Timothy in any of these examples. But what may have been some things that Timothy certainly may have needed to be aware of, given how often Paul, for instance, would talk about them in 1st and 2nd Timothy. What are maybe some things that Timothy had to deal with that would have threatened or tempted him? Okay, so his youth may have been a factor. And certainly, I mean, there are calls by Timothy or by Paul to flee youthful lusts. You know, that's obviously something that all young people deal with, but as Paul writes to Timothy, that's something that Paul expressly encouraged Timothy about, and that's something certainly that Timothy dealt with. Any association of not only the youthful temptations, but also how people viewed him because of his youth, certainly would have been a factor as well, and how he responded to that. Remember what Paul told Timothy, do not let no one despise your youth. Well, what do I do, Paul? Do I stand up and get in their face and yell at them? What did Paul tell him to do? Let no one despise your youth, but be an example. And so in order to win these people over, win those over who were maybe holding his youth against him, don't prove them right by being foolish or unwise in your reactions. Don't have your tempers flaring. Be an example. Okay, let them learn by how you respond and how you conduct yourself that they are wrong to prejudge you based simply on your youth or your age. What else? Because of his youth, there are several references to Paul or to Timothy. Paul says, "Do not neglect." That's not to say Timothy was neglecting, but the fact that Paul, on numerous occasions, he tells him, "Do not neglect the gift that is in you." The committing you to the teaching of the gospel was one, and then also do not neglect the miraculous gifts that are in you. That was given to him by the laying on of Paul. How can you neglect a miraculous gift? How would you go about doing that?
Well, I guess I was thinking about if he was a mentor or mentee, there would have been some maybe hesitation or because he wasn't as experienced, maybe leading the charge, so to speak.
Okay.
So maybe, sometimes we just don't know what we have within us.
Right.
Anyway, we're afraid to step out of that comfort zone.
One thing that that many young people struggle with is confidence. Okay, and I've said this many times, but repetition breeds confidence. The more you do something, the more comfortable you get, because the more you grow accustomed not only to doing whatever it is that you're doing, but any variations of it, like teaching class. A lot of people are nervous about teaching class, not just because maybe of material that has to be presented, but what do I do with questions that people throw at me? How do I respond to those things? And that can be very intimidating. But the more you do it, the more you learn. The more you learn, even when you don't know the answer to something, say, you know what, I don't know. I'm not sure. I haven't read that or haven't studied that. You learn how to handle those types of things. And so it makes me wonder if, not that Timothy was neglecting, but maybe Timothy, because of his youth, maybe he wasn't as outgoing, maybe as straightforward in terms of having that confidence to lead out. Maybe that was, and again, because of his youth, and because of maybe especially that in the back of his mind, I don't want people to think I'm trying to take over or trying to be in charge, and holding that against me because I'm young. There may have been a timidity, okay? He may have been a little bit timid, or maybe that temptation was there to be timid, which is why Paul calls on him on several occasions, not just to not neglect the gift, but also to command and teach and to do these things and to fulfill your ministry. And there's that call to action that Paul constantly offers to Timothy. And I think that youth, it all kind of goes back to his youth, I think, because Timothy may have been a little bit ultra aware of that component with the brethren. Nolan?
The phrase that first came to my mind when you began to talk about this was lack of self-confidence, but maybe it's beyond that. Maybe it's lack of God confidence. The passage up there, verse 14, you said these things that were put into him. It wasn't just Timothy. He had some miraculous gifts. He had teaching the word, all these things that come from God. Sometimes we don't have the confidence in God, His Word, whatever.
That's true.
Can work for us. It may be us
Yeah.
also.
Yeah.
I guess see some of that in Timothy.
Sure. Having that, and of course it's not that Timothy wasn't knowledgeable or grounded, but having that conviction. That's why there's a big difference between belief and faith. A lot of times our religious world, they conflate the two. They think they're one and the same. They're not. Conviction, persuasion, speaks to that degree of belief to the point that I'm willing to do whatever is needed to be done. And the fact that Timothy may have had to grow in that. And certainly Paul helped him in that. He took him under his wing to help nourish that willingness to lead out, to step out and be strong in the faith, to teach the gospel. And what does he say in 2 Timothy chapter 4 about teaching the gospel? When should he do it? In season? Out of season. Okay, whether it's popular and people want to hear it or not. And I've taken great comfort from passages like that to remind me that you answer to God regarding what you teach. Okay, yeah, the brethren may write your checks, but it's God that you answer to regarding standing for the truth. And so sometimes you have to ask yourself, am I willing to sacrifice my livelihood in this moment for standing for what's right? And it's times like that where you're kind of put in those types of situations that build character. And I've been in those situations, and it's tough. But when you go through that and you say, I'm going to do what God wants me to do, regardless of what happens, that strengthens you so that the next time you come across a situation, listen, I've been through this before. Okay, if I was willing to do it before, why wouldn't I be willing to do it now? And Timothy probably needed to go through that same process. Yeah, no.
On that idea of do not neglect, what did that mean? Certainly he was teaching, preaching, doing 1,000 things. I think verse 15 kind of gives a little explanation about that. You meditate on them, give yourself entirely to them. Yeah, he was using them to some extent,
Yeah.
but not entirely. It's Paul encouraging him on.
Yeah, and then in verse 15, that progress, yeah, that growth is evident. And I think that's notable as well, that obviously, and nobody ever gets to a point where, and as we've talked in our lesson on Sunday, you never get to a point where you should be satisfied with your growth, that you're done, that you've grown as much as you need to. But certainly Timothy being a young fella, and certainly all of these responsibilities to teach the gospel, to utilize his miraculous gift, and of course, usually utilizing a miraculous gift certainly going to draw attention to him, and maybe he didn't necessarily like having people all look at him. Maybe he didn't like the limelight. Again, maybe that timid character. But the fact that Paul had to tell him, that's not what this is about. This is about God. This is about his word. This is about his power. Let the praise and the glory and the attention be on Jehovah and on Jesus. It's because it's not about you. And of course, I don't think Timothy had that issue thinking it was about him. But certainly, maybe Timothy was a little wary of stepping out into the limelight like that. All right. What about, yeah, Ben?
Maybe reading too much into the back in verse 8, it says, bodily exercise profits a little, but godliness profits all things. When we're younger, we tend to think about our physique,
How we look?
thing, how
Could
we
be.
look. I don't know, maybe that's something.
Yeah, that could be.
I know Paul does a lot of the sports analogies,
Yeah.
exercise, bodily type stuff.
Yeah, he does. But you're right. There is a certain, with youth, there's a little bit of vanity sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes. And it may be that, and of course, a lot of that's cultural as well. But yeah, it could be. Yeah. Anything else with that? All right, what about characteristics that we should take from Timothy and seek to emulate or apply? Again, there's not a lot in terms of Timothy himself. We have references to him, but what can we take?
We talked before about when Paul first met him, and made it clear, you're the guy that I want for this job.
Right.
And circumcised him.
Right,
He was ready to give it all and go for it.
right. And we, as we,
I don't see any protest.
that, yeah, absolutely. The fact, and as we talked about, and he was an older young man, okay, again, in those mid to late teens, early 20s, being circumcised, that's kind of a big deal at that point, and there was no hesitation there. Whatever's going to help the spread of the gospel, whatever's going to help teach, he was willing to do. It also would seem that Timothy was humble, okay. There's no reference, there's no, not that Timothy necessarily didn't need to ever be reminded to be humble, but there's no reference by Paul, hey, remember that this is about God, not about you. There's none of that. Paul, on numerous occasions with the Corinthians, has to deal with that because there were a lot of people who were trying to take over and take charge and do things. But Paul, with Timothy, in reference to Timothy, it would seem that Timothy was a very humble, maybe even to a fault. That he was so humble that he didn't want attention, he didn't want to put himself out there, and that may have led to some timidity, as we talked about. But it would seem that he was very humble. It would seem he was very committed, and the fact that he could fall back on the example of his grandmother and his mother as well would have certainly helped him. And I think that that's something we can take from this as well for those of us who may have family members, loved ones, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, whatever, who are or were faithful Christians, to remember those examples, to remember that, for instance, Lois, the grandmother, I assume she had passed away by this point, but presumably, certainly she was a faithful Jew. Whether or not she had ever lived to the point to become a Christian, we don't know. But the mother was. Eunice did become a Christian. In fact, we're told in Acts 16 that she was a disciple. So she was a Christian. So the fact that he could fall back on that genuine faith and example of his mother and grandmother certainly, I think, helped him and should help us. And not only family members, but on numerous occasions, Paul would write to the saints about marking those brethren who walk in such a way that stand for the truth, who teach the gospel, who show forth the love and concern and care for each other, to mark them and emulate them. You have them for an example. So not just family members, but certainly one another that we should look to and say, I wish I could be more like Keith or Doug or Stephanie or whatever. Okay, individuals who show forth that example. Yes, he had a good reputation. That's right. In Acts 16, remember, he was spoken well of among the brethren in Derbe and Iconium, I believe it was. And so both of those congregations, or the brethren of those places, they all spoke highly of Timothy. They respected him a lot. And that says a lot, especially given the fact that he was a young fella. So he didn't just kind of go in with a toe, testing the waters. He was all in. I think that says a lot about him too. The fact that he was willing to suffer, the fact that he was willing to be persecuted as he was thrown in prison in the late 60s AD. So we know he was willing to suffer persecution, and certainly being with Paul, when you see somebody else willing to go through it, you certainly don't want to not go through it when you're watching, for instance, the Apostle Paul go through it right next to you. And so I'm sure being with Paul helped him to be courageous and helped him to be willing to endure. But even after his time with Paul, it sounds like Timothy maintained that mindset that I'm willing to suffer no matter what. Anything else about Timothy? No.
He was younger, he was, however you feel in the blank, willing to be second, willing to be taught.
Yeah. To be trained.
Training.
That's right. A lot of times young people, especially young guys, we can have pride a little bit. And so anytime we're instructed, or anytime there's anything maybe corrected that needs to be corrected, sometimes we may resist that. And this is true of all young people. And to a certain extent, even as adults, we have to be careful of this as well, that we don't push back when we know somebody's right, and yet my pride won't let me admit it. The fact that Timothy seemed to have been very malleable. He seemed to have been very, again, humble, willing to be shaped by Paul, by the gospel, to do those things that he needed to do to fulfill the teaching of the gospel. So I think that says a lot about him as well. Yeah, great point. All right, so that's it for Timothy. We will pick up with Titus and Silas next week. Again, those notes are on the back table as well as in your email. Thank you, everybody.